I'm joined in studio by international affairs analyst Dan Perry, the former Europe and Middle East editor at the Associated Press, and also the author of Ask Questions Later newsletter. Dan, thank you for being here. It is no surprise that we continue to hear more U.S. pressure calling for Netanyahu to do a little bit more, but it does seem that they are ramping up with these calls for an election to replace Netanyahu.
Absolutely. It's unseemly and it isn't done, but it's a refreshing degree of candor, I think. The Americans are in an era of election, and normally I expect to hear only lies from politicians, but I'm fairly certain Schumer spoke the truth, and it's almost amusing to behold President Biden trying not to be gleeful about it. It's very clear that Netanyahu and Biden are polar opposites, politically and also temperamentally. Biden is typical of the Israeli center-left. He speaks of himself as a Zionist, but he's a center-left Zionist, always looking for compromise, trying to be reasonable, not above occasionally projecting weakness in so doing, by the way. Netanyahu is classic right-wing tough guy, and never the twain shall meet. So it was rather unusual to see Netanyahu and Biden shoulder to shoulder after October 7th. That was a consequence of the incredibly profound thing that happened on that day, and it sort of reordered the universe. But now the universe is back to its natural state, in which Biden can't stand Netanyahu, and the opposite is undoubtedly also true.
What about the fact, though, that the United States is pushing for an election here? What kind of a legitimacy do they have in?
Like I said, Nicole, it's just not done. But you know what also isn't done? Clinging to power while being on trial for bribery generally isn't done. Mostly, no one ever thought the person would run in that situation, even with the accounts looming against him. Also not done is flying to Washington and appearing before the U.S. Congress to argue against the policy of a sitting American president, when that same president is basically bankrolling your defense. No, we are past the age of niceties. So yes, it's inappropriate, but much of what goes on is inappropriate. So, as I said, to me, as I look upon it, it is candor, and Israelis will have to weigh as they try to figure out what to do in a genuinely complex situation, whether they're okay with having their prime minister be clearly at loggerheads with the U.S. Now, I expect Biden to continue to support the war effort, by the way, through gritted teeth, but it's also clear that the political pressure on Israel will increase, and we have a basic context here in which Biden, like most of the global leadership, supports Israel's goals in a war. Clearly, you have to be a very strange person to want Hamas to remain in power in Gaza. But there is a howling desire from Korea to California for Israel to agree on a plausible day-after plan, and basically the Israeli security establishment is part of that. The Israeli security establishment has been telling Netanyahu their options from worst to least bad are Hamas in Gaza, chaos, Israeli occupation, or some version of the PA, which Israel should try to improve and rejuvenate. And right now, Netanyahu's refusal to contemplate that least bad option, which is indeed bad, but it's the least bad, is a one-man show that is causing Israel tremendous strategic damage, and is basically delaying possibly the Rafah operation, because you cannot do that last stage of the war, which I fear is necessary without international legitimacy. And the credit line for international legitimacy has expired.
I want to talk more about the Rafah operation later in this broadcast, but first I want us to turn our attention to the holy city of Jerusalem. Some 80,000 worshipers prayed at the Temple Mount today, according to the Islamic administration that looks over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And while prayers marking the first Friday prayer of Ramadan ended peacefully, security is still on high alert in the area. I want to go live to our correspondent in the field. Pierre Clochender is in Jerusalem right now. Pierre, what is the atmosphere right now?
There is a sense of a display, at least, of a festive atmosphere, but without the lights and the extravaganza of Ramadan of previous years. Simply because this Ramadan is respected under the shadow of a war that affects everybody, not only Israelis, obviously, but also Palestinians.
Earlier this week, Mahmoud Abbas appointed Mohammed Mustafa as the new prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. So when we're talking about this possibly reformed PA, it seems there is a new face and all a part of this. So how does this play out in the West Bank and possibly Gaza in the future?
Well, the PA itself has a legitimacy crisis because it hasn't faced an election since 2006, election which, by the way, Hamas won a plurality in a legislative election. And Mahmoud Abbas is not particularly popular, and it's seen as widely corrupt. The new government is an effort to achieve many things at once, to address the corruption issue, to distance a little bit officially from the Fatah party, which might be a way of signaling to Hamas that the government is less of an anti-Hamas government, ironically, to somehow fit a square peg into a round hole and enable everyone to accept the PA once more as legitimate, not only Israel and Netanyahu, but the Palestinian people and the people of Gaza as well. And in Jerusalem, it is good to see that the first Friday of Ramadan went by without scuffles, as Pierre said. Clearly a result of that rare display of sagacity on the part of the government, where they agreed to go easy on the restrictions on Israeli Arabs. You know, there was this naive sense that I may have been guilty of as well, of thinking that Hamas would somehow prefer to have a deal by Ramadan. But of course, the truth is that you're dealing here with monsters who want the death and the destruction to continue, and who are hoping for nothing other than for the fighting to continue during Ramadan and to potentially spread to the West Bank and to unrest in Israel itself. That is clearly their goal. And it's very wise of the government to clearly take action to try to ease tensions as opposed to exacerbate them.
Well, we certainly are still seeing the fighting continuing in the Gaza Strip. And as it does continue, Hezbollah in Lebanon says they're going to keep firing at northern Israel. Is a diplomatic solution on the horizon on the northern border? Dan, when we're hearing these reports, Lebanon seems to want to agree to this French proposal.
Yeah.
But it takes also Israel and it takes Hezbollah.
For Lebanon to be positive about the proposal is only slightly more relevant than for France to be positive about the proposal, because Hezbollah controls Lebanon. And it's also rather amusing to hear Hezbollah say they will respect whatever the government of Lebanon decides. That would be news. I mean, that would be the first time in 30, 40 years, 35 years of Hezbollah's domination of Lebanon that such a notion was even contemplated. But it is a good sign that they're pretending. It's generally thought that Hezbollah doesn't want full war with Israel, because Israel will have to be very, very brutal in its reply. Israel doesn't want it either. I mean, a true war with Hezbollah, given the rockets that they have, could bring down apartment towers and office towers in Tel Aviv. And Israel will have to really, really do enormous damage to Lebanon to make the point. They've made it clear that they would. No one wants this. And Hezbollah doesn't have the degree of control of Lebanon that Hamas has in Gaza. They can't be completely indifferent to public opinion, and public opinion in Lebanon hates the idea. And so they are probably hoping, like everyone in the world other than Iran and possibly Netanyahu, that this war ends immediately, because it puts them in a very bad position. They feel they have to continue to give lip service to supporting Hamas, and it's more than lip service for the almost 100,000 Israelis that had to leave their homes near the border. But they really don't want to force Israel's hand and cause a war. This French plan is an elegant and rather obvious way out, and it may come down to the Sheba Farms, which is really part of the Golan Heights. Now, Israel annexed it, but the actual dispute was between Syria and Lebanon back in the day, and it's almost meaningless to Israel. So I expect the tough guys in the government to be horrified at the notion of giving up a few square miles of Sheba Farms, but it would possibly be a ladder that everyone can use to climb down from what is currently a very dangerous precipice.
Hezbollah continues to say that their response towards Israel all weighs on the response and the ongoing fighting in Gaza. And right now, Netanyahu approved an IDF plan to move forward with an operation in Rafah and evacuate the some 1.5 million Palestinians who are living in the southernmost city of Gaza. Now, there's quite a bit of international concern over an impending Rafah operation, and the United States says they have yet to see any of Israel's plans.
given the large number of civilians in Rafah, about 1.4 million, many of whom, as the foreign minister said, have been displaced from other parts of Gaza, we have to see a clear and implementable plan, not only to get civilians out of harm's way, but also to make sure that once out of harm's way, they're appropriately cared for.
Dan, when we're looking at the potential for a Rafah operation, what might this look like amid all of this international pressure?
Well, Blinken is not the only one who hasn't seen a plan. The Israeli public hasn't seen a plan. And, it's okay when you're running in a war to keep your cards close to the vest. But in this case, there's some obvious things that Israel might be projecting right now that they're going to do. For example, a plan to clear out over 1 million displaced people.
That does not happen overnight.
It doesn't happen overnight. It could be chaotic and calamitous, and Hamas could flee with them. There needs to be a plan, and if one exists, I obviously haven't seen it, much like Blinken, and there is a sense that Israel's playing for time. I'm really sorry to say this. Increasingly, and you hear this in Israeli discourse, you hear it from the military, there is a sense that there's a political need on the part of the government to maintain low intensity warfare for a long, long time. And of course, the ones who are freaking out about this the most are the families of the hostages still. Over 100 hostages who may not have all this time. But when people have been in power for too long, when leaders and governments have authoritarian inclinations, there are several stages to this. And in the final and most dangerous stage, you have a hubristic indifference to public opinion and to anyone else's views of what should happen, for example, what we think here in the studio at I24.
So then when we are talking about the potential for a hostage release deal, an Israeli delegation going to Qatar, and there's reports now, White House National Security Advisor John Kirby said that the Hamas response, it is within the bounds of the framework. So it does seem that both Israel and Hamas possibly inching closer and closer.
I very much hope so. If I had to look at populations or groups of classes of persons whose words I don't believe, one is politicians who are running an election, another is leaders of Iranian-backed militias in Lebanon, and the third is anyone involved in any kind of negotiation. So I hope Kirby speaks the truth, and I hope it's correct. I have been saying for many months that it seems unlikely that Hamas will give up the last of the hostages without receiving what they want, which is some kind of life insurance policy, or what they really want, which is a victory in the form of Israel leaving Gaza Strip. No matter how badly they've been battered in their twisted psychology of jihadism, it's a victory if there's 3.5 of them left standing and they continue to control the Gaza Strip. So I'm not seeing a deal happening anytime soon for all the hostages, unless the war is over and Hamas agrees to go into exile. More likely is a partial deal, and that would be a great step forward.
And right now it is all just reports, but Dan Perry, appreciate you breaking down these latest developments as always.
My pleasure.